Good evening to all. Namaste and welcome to this panel session on Indian entrepreneurship, trends, and future research. When we go out of this room 2 hours down the line, we are looking at three things as takeaways from today's discussion. First is have a picture around the macro trends around Indian entrepreneurship. I know most of this room would already know it, but in case you didn't know, FYI, very short bit around it. Second part is going to be slightly elaborate in terms of focus, where we are going to look at research possibilities, both in terms of research ideas, theoretical frameworks, potentially of interest, methodologies to consider, as well as reflections from across the board in terms of what can we do to improve, change some of the Indian scholarship, especially focused on Indian entrepreneurship. That's the second part. And then the third part of the focus is what I personally would like as hopefully the biggest takeaway from the discussion is how can we create a community around Indian entrepreneurship focused scholarship? What form and shape does that look? And how do we keep the conversation going? So that is the third part, and hopefully what I personally would like as the biggest takeaway going out of this room 2 hours down the line. With that as the background expectation, let's start with a wee bit of intro. I'm going to do the intro in my way of the three, and then if you want to do an elaborate intro of yourself, feel free to do it. Okay. Starting with Suresh sir. Suresh sir for me is like the OG of Indian entrepreneurship.
I evaluated your thesis. That old.
So right from Head Start in 2008 to doing the PhD around India-focused entrepreneurship and NSR cell and all of it. But that's only half the story of Suresh sir. If you want to know the full story of Suresh sir, you should also know the 1987 Week Man of the Year.
Yeah.
That's his father, not him, his father. Not him. Yeah, not him, but his father, which is Dr. B.V. Parameshwar Rao, whose contribution into villages in Andhra Pradesh is one of these stories of rural entrepreneurship in India, and what his brother continues to engage with and stuff. So half the story is what you know of Suresh sir and NSR cell, but the bigger story for me is behind the scenes. Okay, that's my intro of Suresh sir. Talking about Raj for me is like the unsung hero of Indian entrepreneurship research. I'll tell you why I say so. PhD from EDII, very unassumingly gets into a postdoc in Nord, gets into a faculty position in Nord, and more unassumingly comes back and sets shop at Great Lakes in Chennai. And if you look at what he has done in the last 6 months, sorry, like 6 years, JMS, SCJ, ETP, Technovation, 3 HBR cases, if I'm not wrong, and probably I've missed 2-3 things. That for me is one of the unsung hero stories of Indian entrepreneurship and what can be done. You will not see him in any conference. Like, had I not arm twisted him into something that the four of us wanted to do 2 years ago, which did not go anywhere, but then had I not arm twisted him into a conversation between the four of us, he would have very happily stayed at Anna Nagar home and done his stuff. So for me, like extremely unassuming in terms of what he does, but then sort of work speaks for what he does. And talking about Ira, again, not potentially, she said like this is her first India conference. So not potentially a familiar face in these circles. But if you go by what the likes of Joanna Mayer says about her, without Joanna Mayer knowing that I know her, speaks volume for what the bigger academic community values and appreciates her work for. And for me, like the rising star. So you have the OG, the unsung hero, and the rising star. That's the ensemble cast that we have for today's panel discussion.
I like that the rising star is the oldest.
With that background, let's start by thinking about some of these macro trends. Sorry, anything that you wanted to add? I just did my version of the intro. No, it's fine. Okay. Right. Okay. Talking about getting into today's discussion, let's start with a story. This is a story from a phone call that I had with a friend of mine in Bombay about an year and a half ago. Evening time, late evening time, India. So on the call, I can hear some background noise happening at the end of it. And then somebody at the back said, "ये तो ज़्यादा ही equity पूछ रहा है." Is it like, who said that? And there comes our grandmother protagonist into the story. Apparently, Shark Tank was running on TV. And then we had grandmother giving startup equity advice now, which for me is a big time cultural mindset change around entrepreneurship that we are seeing thanks to startup reality shows like Shark Tank, but also what is otherwise going around with regard to the Atal Innovation Mission, Tinkering Lab, new education policy, all of this. So one key trend that we are picking up is the cultural mindset shift that we are seeing around entrepreneurship in the last 10, 15 years. The other big trend that we are seeing is around the ecosystem quality improving. What evidence do we have of this? Twice the number of airports, 59% of the roads have been built in the last 10 years, a 15% growth in the volume of roads that has been built in the last 10 years, meaning logistics becoming simpler. Recent evidence from the Global Entrepreneurship Monitors puts India amongst the second in terms of entrepreneurship quality. A lot of evidence telling us digital changing what it's doing, evidence all pointing us towards ecosystem quality improving in the last 10, 12 years. Third trend, we are nearing gender parity in entrepreneurship. I'll qualify this statement by saying I'm not talking about tech entrepreneurship here. I'm talking general population survey entrepreneurship statistics. So think of this as not just your formal entrepreneurship, but it's the mix of formal, informal entrepreneurship put together. So with that qualification attached, if you look at data from 2001 onwards, 2001, it was a 3:1 male to female entrepreneurship ratio, which in the last couple of years, we are seeing gender parity coming. This is not just entrepreneurship rates. If you go look at Mudra loans, 69% of the Mudra loans, which are loans that are given to MSMEs, is going to women beneficiaries. Jan Dhan Yojana, gender parity with bank ownership. So this is not just an entrepreneurship trend. We are seeing this supported by other similar trends coming together, which is the trend largely around gender parity in entrepreneurship. Final trend is what DPI is doing around formalizing the informal entrepreneurship. With piece of research that's there, which is looking at digital public infrastructure, ONDC, UPI, all formalizing, digitizing entrepreneurship, market visibility through digital platforms. Another trend that we are picking. We talk about all of this in a recent World Economic Forum piece. If you're interested, have a look at it where we talk about all of these 4 trends with some background data to it. With that macro trend setup, if all of this is booming in entrepreneurship, we are the 3rd largest startup ecosystem, 3rd highest number of unicorns, 2nd in GEM ranking on ecosystem quality. What do we do with research? This is the trend line of India entrepreneurship keyword abstract search, last 25 years, and we are still counting in 10-digit numbers, as in like in the tens in terms of, this is ABS 3 or above category of journals. That's what we have in terms of numbers. So that sets the stage for us to think about what can we do in terms of potential research ideas, potential methods, theoretical discussions, reflections, insights into from editorial and reviewing experience into what we can do to improve this number. There is at least 40, 50 in this room. Can we at least double this number in 2 years? Fair enough. So that's the background. Now, opening up this to all panelists in terms of thinking about it, let's start by thinking about it from the research idea standpoint as to what sort of research ideas are you thinking of great potential now and for the future? Chatterjee, okay. Unsung hero, go on.
I'll take last.
Okay, fine.
Okay, interesting. So thanks for having me, first of all. So as you rightly said, I think just too much action in the real world with regard to entrepreneurship in this country. So I used to go to one of those Head Start, and I think it was also called Startup subset of that. So since then, I think we've come a long way in terms of what the ecosystem is doing. So one of the, but I think in terms of what we contribute to, say, entrepreneurial ecosystem research, if you look at the theory developing around that, I think the amount of things that's happening on the field, I think we're doing a lot. But in terms of how this contributes to what our understanding is about ecosystem support, I think is unstated. So I think we should really look at that a little bit more carefully. Second is, I think the other thing that's of interest to me is India as a country, I mean, most of the ideas revolve around values. I mean, people grow up with a bunch of values, and there's just too much heterogeneity in those values. Like if you look at, I worked a little bit in Norway and I looked at a lot of research in the US. To a large extent, there's a lot of homogeneity there. So if you take entrepreneurship theory development and you look at how it is developed, the sample or the population from which this theories come up is largely homogeneous. But when you come to India, it is not so. So if you go to, say, a rural small town, the entrepreneur thinks very differently about scaling vis-a-vis somebody in Bangalore. So the value systems of the individual are very different, and therefore most theories of entrepreneurship, whatever they are, I mean, so I'm carefully using the word theories of entrepreneurship very carefully, because I think we're nowhere near any theory of entrepreneurship. But I think every one of them needs this value element to be brought in, because I think it plays a significant role. And I think our context gives a great setting to study that, because we have the required heterogeneity. So from the agentic angle, so that's another thing. In recent times, my pet peeve is this whole, I know somebody, I had a reject from AMR. So, but the only useful suggestion, or at least many useful things in that review of 15-20 pages, it's almost like another paper actually. But but one thing that struck me hard was, hey, you should go and read this book on practice theory by Nicolini. And I said, okay, for whatever it's worth, let me read it. So, and then I've just become a big fan of practice theory, and I went back to Drucker, who I'm a big fan of, and then said, entrepreneurship is not art or science, it's a practice. And I'm saying, oh my God, we're not seeing so much practice papers at all in entrepreneurship. It's all like, very cognitive, emotions, but we very little talk about practices. So in recent times, I've got onto this thing of trying to use practice theory lens. And I was also looking at just this thing of Heidegger's being in the world ontology, and I was wondering, oh my God, this is close to what we've been talking of in our land since many years. We don't seem to use it. We are used to seeing things in a very positivist thing of, I can easily separate subject-object relationships and study it quickly. Now I'm beginning to think it's much more messier, and I think we get like cool ideas around that. So these are some of the things, and the others, of course, the amount of interrelationships in entrepreneurship. So for example, I'm seeing a lot of startups working with other bodies. So one is, of course, the intermediaries, but I think it's also like with large corporations, with the government, with institutions like educational institutions. So all these interrelationships, I think, also give rise to a lot of interesting research opportunities to study things which we could not study before. So for example, if I wanted to do a longitudinal study, it was very difficult because I would call entrepreneurs and they wouldn't respond repeatedly and all. But now it's much easier because I know I can go to NSRCL, or I can go, I know when you're smiling. It's easy, like, I can go there and, I have a cohort, I have access, I have an environment. So it makes it easier for me to study. So I think we can use a lot of interesting things there too. So I think a lot of these theories, so yeah, I'll stop there. So yeah, that's
Mike.
okay.
It's on its own.
Yeah.
Yes.
So firstly, thank you, Srivas. And in all the introductions you did, you forgot to introduce yourself.
Yeah, that's right.
Thank you so much for having us here.
For a good reason.
No, but you introduced me, or at least brought me closer into this circle. And I must say, collaborating with an Indian author is really much nicer than having these multiple international authors, which is nice for a certain perspective. But when you're discussing something in the Indian context, translating it, you lose a lot, and you waste a lot of energy also trying to explain things. So coming back to the data you showed on the GEM monitor and the gender parity, you did qualify that, but I think for me, there's a lot more happening there that needs to be unpacked. And you said this room has so many people, but of course, I don't know, maybe it's 1/3 or one so women I can see, I'm not sure. But in the Indian context, at least in terms of women's participation in employment, while we might be reaching here, the actual statistics tell a much deeper story that needs to be unpacked. So in the informal sector, sure, we've got a lot of women, but you look at the formal sector, it's really low. And in fact, in some cases, we're lower than Sri Lanka and Bangladesh. So I'd love to understand much more. There are papers out there as to the barriers for women entrepreneurship, but I think they tend to get very generic. We're lifting these Western stories, and some of them, of course, will apply here as well. But if you use it too blindly, then you miss out on some of the nuances here. So I think a more detailed ethnographic, qualitative, perhaps, or even unpacking large numbers as to what is going on here. Interestingly, at the micro enterprise level, like you said, some of the schemes of the government, if they're not tokenism, where women are taking loans, but actually the men are running the whole show, hopefully that's not the case. But then certainly at the other levels, I don't see that many women entrepreneurs, and I don't understand why, given our education and the schemes and the opportunities. So, of course, there is some social, cultural perspective there, but there could be other things as well. So it would be interesting to see research in that area. And when I do look at some of the research from India on women entrepreneurship, I still don't get very good ideas or good pictures. So I think there's a lot more that can be done there. So that is one. And then the other thing is, of course, given the size of the country and what you said about government schemes here, the social part of it, the societal problems, or whether it's environmental or sustainability and social both, we need to collaborate together to solve some of those problems. So it would be interesting to see we've got some amazing stories here, right, about what's happening. They don't tend to scale up, perhaps, which is why they don't reach global. You'll get some awards, one Harvard, one Stanford, but they really don't become as big as you thought the potential was when you saw a story like a Jaipur Fort or something like that. So one is to look at what is happening there, but also to look at, I would love to know as to all these schemes that the government has, or all the policies that are there, are they translating into actual things? What are the schemes that work? Which ones don't work? And the interesting thing is all the data can be unpacked to see. And as researchers, we would like to inform policy that's happening, right? So the government has these policies, but if we would have research on the effectiveness of some or the ineffectiveness on others, then that would be really good data, and we would be having far more impactful research and being part of the story that's happening here. So I think I would like to see what's happening with that kind of change. I think for me, because those are my research areas, those were the two big ones for now, but I'll chip in when something else occurs. Thank you.
Right here. So, yeah, thanks a lot, Srivas. Srivas is like, each time I look at him, is like that new quantum theory is everywhere, right? So it's just not like classical physics where you only at one place, but it is more like quantum. He's there. Where were you, Udaipur? Where were you? I was in Gandhinagar. Where were you here? Tomorrow is somewhere else. He's like buzzing around all the time, and he's trying to pin me down. I'm finding it very difficult to be pinned down. But yeah, thanks a lot for having me. So the couple of comments that I have, first is I would like to correct what you have said in terms of entrepreneurship in India. While yes, we have started to spell entrepreneurship without using a spell check by 2007, that we know how many E's, how many R's, and where ship comes and all. But as a phenomena, we have always been entrepreneurial, except for the time that somewhere in 20th century, we weren't very entrepreneurial because of license Raj. But if you look at historically, Indians have been super entrepreneurial. Right? So probably one of those extremely entrepreneurial communities across the world. You find our stuff all over, spices, clothes, look at Machilipatnam or anywhere else you see, it's all entrepreneurship, like people trying to figure out what to do, how to do, and that kind of is in our DNA. So probably I need to correct you.
Yeah, fair point.
Yeah, but correcting you in public, but just also to emphasize the fact that we are like seriously entrepreneurial community, right? So not necessarily because of it's a new age phenomenon. But having said that, yes, I kind of did my PhD in entrepreneurship and stroke of luck. I didn't realize it would be this big. I just didn't realize that I'll even get a job because I tried very hard to get a job. Nobody gave me a job because nobody was interested in entrepreneurship in 2007. I couldn't have dared apply to A or B because I didn't have the kind of background to have been accepted. So from that time on to see where it has come in a very, very short while. I go to Israel, those guys, I'm sorry if there are any Jewish people here, but the story that they tell about the startup nation and such great things about their ecosystem, when you get to hear them and the swag with which they talk, I tell them we did it in like 1/3 the time that you guys have done it in, right? You are entrepreneurial, you control finances in the US. So if you don't have success stories, who will? They create success story. But we, in a very, very short while, has become so entrepreneurial. If you start to look at, okay, here's an example I give. If you look at Indian movies until 94, 95, villains are all businessmen, right? Thugs and villains have a business, or this guy's a businessman handing. But then the kind of thing flipped and said, now you have swank people shaking hands. So entrepreneurship as a career, even in places like this, has become a narrative, right? At least desirous that I want to be entrepreneurial. So that's the kind of change in a very, very short while. But what I don't like, as he said, is that the narratives that we get to see in academics and in popular literature, he does not take into the spectrum of entrepreneurship that you get to see in this nation. Entrepreneurship is like spectacular in terms of it's an ecosystem, which means that the tiny ant is there, big elephant is there, you have a giraffe there, and that's an ecosystem. You can't have monocrops. When people talk about unicorns, unicorns are mythical creatures that don't survive other than in our imagination, right? So you should have had a better term for it because they don't survive thanks to Baiju's, thanks to a lot of examples that we're getting to see. It is only emphasizing the fact in terms of scale, right? So a lot of conversations that we have to see in our research kind of reflects this plurality that entrepreneurs have. Just because I don't desire to be a unicorn doesn't mean that I shouldn't be researched upon, right? So the way in which I perceive the world, the way in which I connect the dots, the way in which I create value. Creating value is such an interesting thought, right? It's the way you play the game. It's not the cards that you have. It's like, how do you play that game? So therefore, how do you unpack your resources? Nobody talks about sequencing of resources because there is a sequence of resources. Like you don't have any resources to begin with, but still you're playing the game. Then you get some resources, then you're playing some other game, and then you're building value as you're going along in the narrative. Partly could be true, partly need not be, a bunch of assumptions, but that value creation is not talked about in this non-linear manner in which reality works out. We have a very linear manner of opportunity identification, opportunity valuation, opportunity exploitation, right? So we have a very linear perspective in terms of what entrepreneurship is, right? So the advantage we have, which a lot of Europeans and Americans don't have, is one, plurality, two, numbers, right? We have like seriously large numbers to get data from. And to talk about women entrepreneurship is actually seriously buzzing. I run two programs, very large programs. One is Women Startup Program, like tens of thousands are working on. Others, Women Goldman Sachs. This year we trained 300 women. Over the last few years, we trained 3,500 women, all of them scaling, all of them having desires, right? So you can ask, what have I done with this data? Nothing. Nobody has spoken to them. Nobody has realized, how are you doing? What are you doing? When you're talking of scale, where do you like to go to, right? And then, so women entrepreneurship is a huge space. Informal entrepreneurship is a huge space, right? Thanks to digitization. How are some of these people leapfrogging? I'm talking to weavers who now have Instagram accounts and they have like 4,000 followers and they are selling online. And how did he do it? He said, Reels dekhe. That's it.
Instagram
is telling them what to do, and they're learning from it, right? So there's so many ways in which you could unpack what is happening on the ground And I think it's an exciting space, exciting field of research that one could potentially think of. So those of you all who are not sure whether you should be studying entrepreneurship or not, don't think, just jump in. We are there, but it's a great space to get good publications in as well, right? So there's so much to theorize because we don't know.
Yeah.
So therefore, there is so much publishing potential. Yeah. So
Super. Thanks so much, Suresh sir. So just to summarize and sort of add in my thoughts, 4 main broad points that we can looking at. One is more of rural, social, inclusive space of entrepreneurship. Second, around policies, relationships, government, corporate relationships, all of that. Third, around digital, Instagram, ONDC, UPI, all of that space. So broad 3-4 trends of what we could do around this thing. And then Sir didn't talk about culture, but then the cultural entrepreneurship space. We'll start about that.
One more round.
Okay.
I wanted something to talk about the
Next round. Okay, fine. Okay, so we'll talk about cultural entrepreneurship as another big trend in the next round. So those are the 4 things that are potentially very, very strong areas of going forward. Now that we have figured out ideas, now let's think about how will we theorize about these ideas. So we will start with
Reverse.
Ira this way coming.
Reverse
So
this time.
If you are looking at women's entrepreneurship, for instance, what theories are interesting you for answering some of the questions that are in your mind?
Okay, it's a tough one, but just building on that, and then I'll come to the theories. You spoke about this being an exciting space, but I think what's even more exciting is this change that's happening in the last 2-3 years, and you all can definitely be part of, recording that change, or at least describing that change or analyzing that change. So it's really, even from outside, it's so fascinating to see why or what has caused these shifts. Is it just the infrastructure building? Is it just time of what's happening outside? Is it the ecosystem? There's so much more. And therefore, coming to the theories, I think the ones that come to mind would be things like social identity, for instance, and social networks. But with a twist, because we would like to have social networks or network theory, or even what you discuss, effectuation. But in the Indian context, these theories might expand and look a little bit different. And it's good to keep an open mind. And what I was discussing with Apurva earlier, we tend to be generally a little less confident. And I think that shows in our research sometimes, that we see something in the data, but we are unwilling to perhaps speak to it, or we try and fit it with an existing theory, and we lose out. And of course, partly it's because we want to get published, right? So you tend to just go with what everyone's talking about. But if we could be bold enough to actually look at the data and see what it's telling us and connect that data and theory, I think that would lead to something more exciting. So if I have to just list theories, then something on the ecosystem, social, on cognitive theories when it comes to women, or motivation theories, those social cultural aspects are still there, values which you mentioned. I think otherwise, for me, I think I like the space of identity and institutional theory. It's old, but there's huge amounts of pockets there that can be, if you're just looking at these Big 10 theories and trying to fit them in. I will come back to a second round, because right now I cannot think of.
Yeah, maybe I'll just add. So if you look at which are the areas that are trying to get into entrepreneurship is trying to establish an identity for itself, which strategy guys all the time say, like, you don't have a spine. So entrepreneurship is trying to itself as a domain and discipline. But strategy has probably been the one which has been most, in terms of overlap, trying to say that we're going to look at entrepreneurship from a strategical perspective. OB, for some strange reason, has not. And I think OB scholars should look at entrepreneurship, because they kind of gave up on entrepreneurship in the 60s, I think. After identity work, you don't really see too many OB scholars looking at entrepreneurship at all. There's a Robert Barron's paper saying that why OB should look at entrepreneurship. And he looks at various ways in which you could start to look at entrepreneurship as a context to start to look at OB. So So for the first time in, I guess, 8 years since we had, or even earlier since we had core course in entrepreneurship, 2 OB people are taking my course, in my doctoral course for the first time, nobody else. So I think OB should start to come in. IS is playing a great role now in terms of looking at possibilities of digital and entrepreneurship. Marketing should, but they aren't. They're still in their own large space. They're very powerful people because there's so much to talk and students look up to them. And then everything that marketing faculty says, the students kind of grab and then learn. So there is so much about entrepreneurial marketing in terms of, like, I'm talking to Chumbak. Chumbak bought 40 lakh rupees of magnets and they had no money to create a market, right? So they spent all their money, they sold their house, they had a 2-year-old kid, and they created a brand, right? So how do you create a brand when you are like zero and you are living in a rented place? How can you theorize in terms of brand building when you have no resources? But that is what a lot of entrepreneurs are doing. So I think there's a lot that from the marketing guys can come in as well, right? So I think entrepreneurship is a big tent space. Entrepreneurship scholars can look at entrepreneurship, but I think other scholars should also start to look at entrepreneurship as a context. Students in Ahmedabad, you have CII in the neighborhood. Students in Bangalore has NSR cell. People, you come to NSR cell, but most doctoral students only know that as it's right to next Southgate, nobody walks in. But I think there is a huge space for other scholars to come in and then theorize, because there's so much happening and then so much that can be done. But as far as women entrepreneurship goes, I just have been having this thought. I don't have that theoretical framework. The comparison of men to women, I think, is a done deal. And I don't think women researchers should go down that way. I think we should start to understand how do we compare women entrepreneurs to women entrepreneurs? Because given the same set of constraints, some women are doing different from others, right? So how are they able to do this? So it's time to start to look at women to women and then theorize around it, because much of the women entrepreneurship literature has been men to women. So yeah, some suggestions for you.
Yeah, I mean, there's just too many theories around. So I think I go back to, so I look at it at 3 levels, let's say. One is at the agentic level, at the individual level, and I totally agree with Suresh, because it's really, really understudied, at least in our context. I mean, the only papers I've seen in India is this Eisen's theory of planned behavior scale, and then you have series of DVs. So that's the only thing largely we've studied. So I think, like, I don't know why, but we kind of stayed very narrow. But if you look at entrepreneurs, these are people with a lot of I mean, identity, motivational issues, cognitive, metacognitive, emotional. And then, of course, this whole idea of values, because I'm beginning to think this is a society that sometimes makes trade-offs, which probably an American entrepreneur or a British entrepreneur would never make. So people, like, for example, give up scaling opportunities because it's important for the family, it's important for, and these are very coherent, cognitive, well thought of decisions. And these trade-offs make it sound like they are not so successful, but they are actually very successful, because if you look at entrepreneurial well-being as a construct, I'm sure many of these people will be much happier people, leading much better lives. Maybe their scale may be a little bit lower in terms of revenues, but and so on. So I think there's a lot of things to study at the individual level on decision making, why they make those trade-offs. Second thing, at this other level, at the firm level, is, for example, there are lots and lots of Indian firms that don't raise money, and they're perfectly okay with it. They don't want to raise money. They're quite happy keeping these businesses the way they want it to be, and they still scale at a reasonable pace. Now, but they're very profitable. Now, there's this whole story about, do you value or you want to, value, rich was the king. Yeah, but here the reason for the trade-off. So the point is, they also make the trade-offs, but here we make it more consciously. And so I think those are things to really look at, the way we make resourcing decisions. and so on. The third thing is, there's this whole angle about knowledge problems. Entrepreneurship is a knowledge problem. I'm very fascinated by it. Being a country that's always thought of things more deeply from a philosophical angle, I think we've not really, and I think we have huge opportunities to make philosophical contributions to how we should study this subject. So far, a lot of this is driven by this whole idea of, life is a linear act. And therefore, theories have been constructed that way. So most theories are constructed that way. So if we go back to our roots of how we think, I think there could be ways to construct fresh set of theories of why and how organizations birth, grow, decay, etc. So those are the other things. I saw recently some papers from the Indian context written AMJ and all that on intersectionality, for example, using workers from Bombay. So it's so interesting that these kind of contributions, I'm not very sure we have too many settings in other places from where you can actually do this. You cannot simply do it. So why? So I think the key is how do we get those ideas? I think that's more the key.
And we want to just touch on your quasi-practice stuff as a potential way of getting the idea.
So now we are saying so much. You guys have paradox of choices. Right?
Yeah.
So it actually, by saying so many nice things, they're not going to be doing anything.
Yeah. So we'll
So you'll have to say what's exciting you.
Yeah.
Do you want to just kind of pick up on the thought of quasi-practice as an approach of how you think about what's the question that's most interesting?
Yeah. So I came up, I recently published a paper in the Journal of Business Venturing called Quasi-Practice. The idea came from doing a lot of faculty development programs on entrepreneurship. I've been doing this for many, many years. And then I realized most of these faculty, especially who don't do PhDs in entrepreneurship, find it very difficult to go back and actually legitimately teach this. Simply because I'm like a physicist or a medical doctor and I'm teaching entrepreneurship. I go and I teach the frameworks, I do the business model canvas, I stick. And then I asked one of these doctors, so what do your people in the class do? They said they stick ideas on the business model canvas. So I said, but didn't you realize that the business model canvas was created to create hypotheses and not ideas? And he said, oh, but nobody does that. I said, did you ever ask somebody why they don't do it? He said, no, I don't, because that's the way we were taught to do it. So, and everyone does it and everyone gets a business idea and everyone finishes the exercise and everything is done. So what I realized, there's this effectiveness problem of doing this. And that comes because there is no practice experience. The same thing run by a clinical professor who is actually an entrepreneur, the class would be completely different. He would ask those deep questions. He said, why do you choose this? Did you go and collect some data? Do you have evidence? Why don't you go and just talk to 10 customers, then come back and fill this and so on and so forth? So then this got me started. Okay, how can faculty get practice expertise? Now, most universities in India, you can't run a company on the side. It's quite impossible. You can't even go and do something on the side. Forget about running a company. So we are constrained. So this whole idea of let me do experiential learning is almost like a no-no. And so I used practice theory to come up with this very interesting social learning theory of legitimate peripheral participation. So something close to an apprenticeship, but not. So here you don't own the outcomes, but you become part of the process. By doing this, what happens is you as a faculty participate in the actions of an entrepreneur without taking ownership for the outcomes. You're very close. And then practice theory comes in and says, okay, how do you gain knowledge from this kind of a setting? So if I'm a medical doctor, I would work with a healthcare entrepreneur for about 3-6 months, maybe fundraising. And then within 3-6 months, I realized how difficult fundraising is. Rejections, retweaking the business models, making those choices, etc. And then I come back to class and then I'm teaching now a bunch of medical students how to do entrepreneurship. My teaching is very different because I'm now telling them where to use the framework, how not to use the framework, and how to sometimes make tweaks to the framework because I've seen it myself. And therefore, I think, so the idea was, this is something that you can do today. I mean, like NSRCL again. Point is, I have entrepreneurs with whom I can engage continuously for 3 months because they're right there. And so I think theorizing here, again, I took a very standard theory, practice theory. I could have taken that and done something with it. But I noticed that in our setting, when we have 35,000 colleges and everyone needs an entrepreneurship teacher, it's just going to be super difficult for a nation like this to have, only PhDs in entrepreneurship teach. So then how are they going to get the practice expertise? So therefore, I think we have opportunities to kind of creatively come up with new concept. So that was the idea. And so the example I give is more to say that you can come up with creative examples, which is what I think Suresh was trying to have. Let's not just take theories, bucket of theories and apply, but let's creatively use them. So, so I think it gives rise to several other things in other spaces, but I'll stop there.
I think like that sort of an approach of the academic embedding in the setting, theorizing, I think is an extremely big potential this thing. And a form of theorizing that I personally like the most, because I end up doing more of that, at least that's my comfort zone. And from there, a couple of things that I've been picking up in terms of interesting theorizing possibilities is one around how you have, like in rural women cultural sort of settings, there is more of the community entrepreneurship style dynamics, and collective action as a theorizing mechanism becomes quite interesting for those sort of questions. The other element is when you're looking at it from more of a ecosystem developing, building sort of a story, boundary work becomes quite an interesting theoretical framework to look at it. So those are a couple of theoretical frameworks that personally has kind of caught my attention, which I'm kind of engaging with. And micro foundations is something which can really link to what quasi-practice does, what capabilities does, what so I was saying, all of that. So micro foundations is another sort of framework where you can bring either the OB back or the firm back into the discussion, which probably we sometimes ignore when we are too macro in our focus. So those are some of the theoretical things. Yes.
Just thinking that one thing is also not to get caught up only with these theories, and we've done that ourselves in our work. So you look at other disciplines, and cross disciplines certainly should not be missed out. So whether it's psychology, sociology, or whatever, certainly bring in those theories. Yeah, and the one, I did a course with Alvison in Lund University, and one thing he kept telling me is that don't go by the theory. So go with the question, and then, don't get caught up with, I need to work in this theory field, which is good for depth and developing your name as an, academic in that field. But on the other hand, you might lose out on something by getting too sort of narrow in your thinking. So keep an open mind.
Now that we know what theory to do, part of the problem solved. Now we should just look at what methods to do and then write the paper from tomorrow. Okay, so let's get into methods then. What methods are exciting? I'm happy to start. For me, like if you think about, let's start by looking at quant data possibilities. What data sets exist already are a couple of them. One is the Global Entrepreneurship Monitor, which some of us in the room already engage with in some way. Yes, it has certain degrees of limitations, but it's still valuable for certain kinds of questions to be asked and all of it. So one is Global Entrepreneurship Monitor. Second is what IIT Madras has put together recently, which is the YNOS dataset. That is quite interesting because it's India-specific dataset. A lot of founding team information capture. YNOS. 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 That is another data set which is India specific. They have kind of crawled data out from annual reports, websites, all of it, put together it in a nice form. That is quite an exciting possibility as I see it. Third is what could be done at the intersection between Traction. Traction has more of the funding information with something like BoardX, which has more of the board information. I know IIM Ahmedabad folks are super popular for what they do with this intersection. So I'm not the expert on saying this, but then there's enough people in the room who know how that world works. So that intersection is another possibility of what could be done around startup boards, startup TMT style questions to be asked. Traction and BoardX.
How to say that you're seeing everyone here knows it? I don't know this. So just
okay.
tell us more.
So Traction is a funding data set. It's about funding information stuff. BoardX is a data set that has board information like board characteristics, TMT tables.
Yeah, that'd be nice. Yeah.
Right, we used to do wikis in the past. Nobody does wiki anymore. Like, do you guys even know? Like, we have to put a wiki in terms of years data set that is available here or something.
Sure.
So some young person can take it up as their side activity. Wiki for
So we're gonna come to what can we do next step. So we'll come that to next part. Next part. Yeah. That's next part. So next part we'll come to that. Absolutely. So yeah. So wiki. So we have one call to action already. So that's one point. So that are few of the quant data sets that is sort of interesting me. And just picking up on Raj's point earlier on what you can do with schemes, like government scheme effectiveness, all of it, I think there's a lot of possibility around doing RCTs. Looking at schemes, DID around schemes, even for the volume of entrepreneurship training that happens, be it NSRSL, be it test, be it EDA down the road. I was at EDA in the morning and they said like they're training 2 lakh people in a year. I'm like,
You're an IIM, you talk about CIIE.
CIE, yes, sorry, yeah. Sorry.
Don't look at me and say NSRSL all the time. You're an IIM.
So the volume of training that is done, there is a lot of possibilities around randomization, looking at effectiveness around pedagogy, effectiveness about communication, effectiveness around a lot of these are linked to particular schemes of the government, like cottage industry scheme, SIDBI that, Mudra this, all of that. So a lot of possibilities of doing RCT type research around these sorts of things. So that's what I'm seeing from more of the quant world of possibilities.
So yeah, I'm sure CIIE has lots of data. I'm talking about, we collect a lot of data from our women entrepreneurs. We haven't done anything with that. So even with CNOS, right? One of the phenomena that I'm noticing is serial incubatee. People go from one incubator to the other incubator, right? So that's something which could be theorized here, which is extremely prevalent thanks to governmental schemes that are available and lack of
job opportunities.
Lack of investment opportunities, which is beyond the bro culture. If you're from IIT, IIM, you're getting money. If you're not, so therefore you need to look at some of those, right? So Vinos was very good that he converted that into a data set. A lot of incubators have data. I think a lot of this data is also so unstructured that there is work, and thanks to ML algorithms, now you could look at some of these. Like all incubators would have tons of PPTs that entrepreneurs have given them over the years, right? You can do so much of analysis on each location would have PPTs that you could look at. So some are structured and available. Some you will have to put together like the governmental scheme, but it's just hard work. But there are some which is just sitting in incubators, computers. Each time you change your IT, things are getting washed out. But it's there. It's there for people to start to look at, right? And one thing that we didn't talk about here at all is family business. And there are family business programs here, the family business programs in IMB, family business program at ISB. All 3 of them are doing India Strategy Conference. And we have been working with family businesses for so long. And you hear such transformational stories from each of the entrepreneurs who come here and gone ahead and done well. That data is also available, right? So it's, if you have any more thoughts, you could add to these data sets that are both publicly available, privately there, but can be put together innovatively.
Yeah, I mean, I think there are lots of, the one thing that often, the thought that comes to me again and again, there's already so much data. I think very little time to do something with it. So I'm now thinking like, how to use this data. I think that's the bigger challenge. And like what you said, I'm now like, waiting for the session to finish so I can ask him what to do with that women entrepreneur data, because I know they do it at large scale. I mean, every year, and they've been doing it consistently over years. So surprised that we have, like, I'm sure like this, there are so many more data sets.
So it's basically saying that I've been lazy.
No. I mean, I'm just saying
I've been lazy. Okay. Yeah.
No.
We'll talk.
No, now that when you do 10 things, I mean, you have so much data. So the point is that there's a lot of data everywhere. And today, luckily, with all these ML expertise that we have, I think today we have the chance to actually do something about it, because the volume of data in this country is just a lot. We underestimate. And so when students or even peers tell me that, my paper is not getting accepted because data is from India, I said, please don't say that again, because we've had many success stories here. People are publishing from here. the point is we have to, like what you said, is a lot of it is unstructured. I think we need to do that to structure this data and present it in the right manner to give it credibility. And the moment we do that once, and then after that, all the others benefit from it. So I think that's important. While the large data and all those are now becoming easier to write papers on and publish, I'm a big fan of picking data from context and doing qualitative, going deep, spending time on the field, because it just so nice to know what people are doing. You get to understand people so well. So earlier it used to be very difficult. I know, I remember when I was doing a PhD, I wanted to do experience sampling method because I was reading Mihaly Csikszentmihalyi, and I was like, wow, I want to do this with entrepreneurs. So I started a project, and then after like 3 iterations, the 4th iteration, after sending even 3 reminders, I could not get, and then I said, okay, that's it, I'm stopping. But today, now what I realize is today we have like CIIE here, where you have a reason why people can be cajoled to participate, right? They can't just drop off and then go disappear. So, which is what I think an MIT or a Harvard was good at, and which is why they published all those papers, because they had access to these people. And today I think we have the access. So the thing is, good, well-designed RCTs, ESMs, I think could just unpack a lot of these processual, longitudinal, what happens over time phenomena in a much more organized manner. So I think there's a lot of opportunity also to collect data and create these nice data sets. So when you have cohorts coming every year, then you know what happens over years. So much you can do. And I think so many others are also doing this. So I think it's important to also see how these settings can be utilized for putting together data sets. And I'd really also, I mean, family business is something which is, I was just reading this recent report. I think 80%, 73 or 75% of India's GDP today is family business, and by 2047 it's going to be like something like close to 87 or something. Ooh. So if that is the percentage contribution of family business to this country, yeah, we ought to be writing more about it. So I think there's potential, and these family businesses also come in a variety. I mean, there's little family businesses, large ones, and so there's so much happening in that space. So that's another. In fact, we're even at Great Lakes trying to launch a family business program, saying, hey, if I get a bunch of people to do this annual program, then you get access to these 30-40 businesses. You stay with them for the whole year. You make them do something, and then you're also getting data out of it. So you know what these things are doing. So I think there's absolutely immense scope for data. So data shortage is not the problem. Yeah. Not doing enough structuring, and I think structuring is the key. A lot of this is disjointed data sets. How do you connect and use them well? So I think if you aren't doing too much ML, and if you aren't doing that and you're early in your PhD, I think it's a good chance to actually pick those methods up. I think they're going to come in handy.
Yeah, because that's also the theme of this conference, right? Yeah. Use AI, ask AI to tell what to do. AI will tell you what to do, right? It's not enough to tell you how to build it up. And one thing that in terms of the family business that we completely ignore is the intergenerational wisdom that they have. We kind of completely discounted that, and we don't really talk about it. I was listening to this person, Winnie Cosmetics. It was mind-blowing. He was talking in Hindi with little smattering of English. But the insights he had to create the categories of products that he has created is insane, right? Like, how did he even get that fog chal raha hai? Like, they displayed Axe. Axe had such a swag to it all over. It disregarded the kind of advertising that they had to do. And this man comes out of nowhere and creates a product and decimates this global product out of nowhere, coming from a tiny place. I'm not sure tiny place, but Ahmedabad. But I mean to say, in terms of like from a global perspective, to take on these large multinationals. So how have they done that? We have completely ignored that wisdom, right? So that could also be an interesting value proposition in terms of looking at how have they created value, which again will help in these intergenerational aspirations that family business seem to have, right? They seem to discount what the grandparent has and place value on what somebody like me who has never run a program. I've never run business. I'm married to a Sindhi. She tells me all the time that I have nothing that I can run a business with. So don't ever believe what you say, because you don't have So that particular, it can also be theorized, it can also be
Absolutely.
converted into knowledge sets, right? So there is
And in
so
fact,
much.
like, talking about business communities, like we have always just considered the like if you kind of look at whatever is bit a piece of there about business communities, it's mostly just been about Sindhis and the Patels of the world. But then if you look at the pies of Mangalore, Chettiars of Chennai and stuff, there is a whole different this thing, because Anupama was telling me about like what Voda Bhashya, right? Which is like which is how you talk about vegetables in terms of Pandavas. Like Pandavas are fresh today. Apparently means the vegetables in the market are fresh today, and that's the grocer's language in Mangalore. Like the whole discussion around language and entrepreneurship has extremely different connotations in different parts of India, which we have never even kind of scratched the base on.
Maybe we should open up for questions.
Yes.
No, I'm going to add something on the qualitative part, because I think there was, so I started out studying quantitative, but I found if I really want to understand some of the questions, then qualitative, it's also like you said, Raj, I enjoy doing it because the interaction and the nuances you get. So I started out once on a paper on how entrepreneurship has helped these women in rural. And then I found when you actually speak with them, the well-being outcomes are not as you would imagine. And that kind of stuff you only get from individual ethnographic kind of approaches. It would be lost in an average set of data measurements. So it would be great if you can combine them, but of course, qualitative has its own place. And the other thing on data sets, I don't know how it works here, but I find that extracting data using NLP, etc. I'm not sure if you have, for example, we also have a video audio data, and to extract some of this and get some nuances. So for example, people are getting data out of user reviews, and then you need a Python code to actually extract that. But for me, we have some expertise where it helps out. I don't know how it works here, but at the IIMs, I guess there's a lot of people, but in India, you've got all these coding experts. I would imagine to get some of the data out, you need some excellent, otherwise you might make errors and, misinterpret the entire data, which is very dangerous. The third thing is on the measurement aspect, which is not exactly what we were speaking about data, but I would love to know how would you measure, for example, the impact of sustainability programs or women's programs. What would you use to actually measure the outcomes? That would be interesting to think through. And one last thing was that so there's also creative ways of looking at the data, and not just the obvious direct ones. So for example, William Powell has this paper where he looked at vineyards and wine and categorization theory. So I'm thinking, we've got enough of that we've also got the whole philosophical side you spoke of. Johanna Meyer used to always keeps telling me to read some German philosopher. I mean, I never have the courage to tell her read some Indian philosopher as well. But I think it would be interesting to look at other kind of sources of data that would tell us about Indian entrepreneurs.
Exactly. Like if you're essentially looking at like decolonizing the narrative and all of it, you need to start looking at
there are other things
from other directions.
Right. So there's creativity in how you apply your data and things like that. Yeah.
So now we have figured out ideas, we know theories, we know methods. Now we just need to know how we write it. So that will move us to the next section of the discussion, which is sort of like debrief into.
Srivas, can I just say one thing? I mean, I was just reminded sitting here in IIM Ahmedabad, I didn't want to forget. I remember having long conversations with this professor called Dujendra Tripathi. He was a business historian. He taught here for many years. And when I was doing my PhD, I used to come and spend some time. He is retired then, but he used to be very kind to give time. And one of the methods I think underused is this historical methods. There are methods of using history to study. So I'm just reminded of him and his constant prodding to use it, saying that, a lot of family businesses in India have, implicit knowledge of the history of their own family businesses, transferred across generations, sometimes even documented in the form of little books, notebooks, etc. But unfortunately, a lot of them just stays with them and is not transferred or translated. So I think, I know Vadvani and all these guys have been talking about using historical method. I think we have a lot of knowledge to actually use some of those methods to actually contribute to a lot of theory building. So I think we should,
and if anybody wants to pick a brain on how to do it, Anupama is the person to go and ask us. 1800s to 1920s Ayurveda, like so, working on historical archives and all of it is quite a story.
Okay.
Asinma here, absolutely, yeah. So just kind of moving the narrative on, we saw this stat earlier, which is India is in the sort of tens range. The next biggest ecosystem is China, which is in the 50s range in terms of number of papers that is kind of coming out. So the ask or the sort of call for action for this room is, can we at least double the number from the 10s to the 30s in the next 2 years? And the next set of discussion that we want to kind of have, opening up the discussion, is to get your thoughts on what we could do as an academic community into building the narrative around Indian entrepreneurship. I mean, like, reflect on what we have said, any thoughts that you might have, questions that you might have, plus what do you think could happen to push the narrative? So opening this up for comments.
So maybe I should put up a challenge, right? So here, so much that you spoke about, so much that can be done, honky-dory scenarios. Can we have like 50 FT50s from India or in the next 5 to 10 years, like in 10 years time, that start to say that create a big bang that people start to look at as seriously, that all of us together will say that, look, let's target. And then I don't think it's too hard. I really don't think it's too hard. We just have to collectively put our minds to it. But we could take up some challenge, which is slightly hard to get, but we'll get somewhere there.
It's a good challenge.
Good challenge.
Good challenge.
I'm looking at everyone. Not myself.
Yeah. Yes.
I think it's better.
Yeah, it's better to take a money.
Thank you. Professor Raj, you're mentioning about entrepreneurship as practice. That will be a good context to start in the Indian entrepreneurship academia or setting, because Europe has done a very good job of it. For the past 8 or 9 years, every year they have an entrepreneurship as practice conference.
Yes.
And Neil Thompson from your university, he's the one who was, when he was a very junior academic, he was running the doctoral colloquiums and all. Will Gardner, Daniel Horth and all, they're very active in that. And that's really, I've been to that conference 2 or 3 times, and it's really refreshing. Because it's practice.
Yeah.
It's very, very applicative, and the works of people like Chris Stayett and all who think outside the box of doing entrepreneurship. If we can replicate something like that in India, I think we have a winner on hand, because that bridges all the narratives which Srivas and Professor Suresh, all of them are talking about, because we have so much entrepreneurial activity here. And when we start looking at it only from a theory and not practice angle, that's when we lose the people over here.
Yeah.
So once we bring, so probably that's a segue for us.
Super.
That's a nice action point, though, to create a small community of.
For you, I said.
Activity to people. Yes. People. Yeah.
So Suresh is really the senior now. He's like, that job is for you. Okay, very good. Now I take it on. But I think it's a very cool idea. I've been thinking of it, but I think, if there are enough people interested, we can actually all join hands and say, okay, here's a little community of practice. Let's all meet once a month or once a year in person and online. And today we can do that and actually build a knowledge-based community. And then I think then we could get papers out. Yeah, that's it. Thanks. I'm so glad you.
Good evening. My name is Prasanna Sai Bhagavatula.
Okay.
Yeah. So it's great to be here, and thanks a lot for all the knowledge that is being shared. My question is about teaching entrepreneurship. You mentioned sticky notes and people not having the practical side of things. I find it very, very startling that you have, some of the academicians here have a lot of power. You send some of the PGPX students to shadow the CEOs. You have the power to give experiential learning to them. And my doubt is, why can't we do that to the PhDs as well? Send them to shadow some of these entrepreneurs, give them a taste of entrepreneurial skills, real time, and call in some of these folks who are new budding entrepreneurs in the market in Bangalore, sitting in coffee shops, call them into IIMB and then deliver some lectures. To me, it's, I think IIMB, IIMA, ISB to collaborate and to make this kind of a conference happen. It's taken a long time. I'm glad it's happening once a year now. I wish it could happen 6 months every so often. And so, I mean, these are all puzzling questions to me in my mind. So if you can throw some light on that. You, sir, Mr. Bhagavatula, you as well. Thank you.
Yeah. So the thing is, I guess,
I think so.
so absolutely. I saw the reason why doctoral students don't come and work at NSR but that's no longer the case. Sachi has worked with NSR students. Actually, Vidula was the first one who did it many years ago. Anusha, thanks. Senior moment. Anusha did it with entrepreneurs from NSR. So we do have PhD students here in IIM Ahmedabad who are working with CIIE. So it is happening right now. Maybe you haven't seen it out in publication. Some of them have, some of them haven't. But a lot of them have started to work with doctoral students. Doctoral students have been working with entrepreneurs. Go listen to events, listen to entrepreneurs. It happens quite often, actually. But good suggestion for others to come and attend things that happen, because for a lot of doctoral students in these institutions, it's too easy. It's in the backyard, right? If you're from Bangalore, you need 100 permissions to enter IIMB. A is easier. B is has been very hard. But if somebody wants to, I'm happy to enable that. Our students are doing it. But if any other students want to, we're happy to. I think compared to what people think, IIMs are not that hard to enter. So we seem very difficult, but then if you know the right way, it's very easy to get in. I can facilitate that in Bangalore for sure. And then, that's the case anywhere in there. You need to know which lever to press. Yeah.
Yes, Vivek.
Yeah, are you going? So I have a question. So when you work on Indian context, there is always a trade-off between contributing broadly to the theoretical contribution versus vis-a-vis the contextual or the phenomenon contribution. So how do you manage that trade-off?
Interesting. I think we have to kind of think about this probably as two steps. One is partly answering the question, but partly also reflections from experiences that we have had, both in terms of going through the publishing journey as well as reviewing for journals as to what do we do when we get this comment, because it's a very common comment. And second, when we give this comment, what do we expect to see back? Thoughts? Ira, if you want to start. There's no mic. Okay, so Raj starts.
I can give you.
No, Raj, we'll get the mic back.
Because you have the mic.
Raj starts. Yeah, Raj starts. Yeah.
I realized. Yeah, now I realize I should come like a few minutes behind. I didn't realize it was only 2 column mics. I thought there were 4. So okay. So I think of journals as marketplace for ideas, right? Ideas that you believe in, and ideas that you can articulate clearly, ideas that you can argue for coherently, consistently, and provide enough evidence. Right? Think of them in that way. So when you read an article, the first thing I think, at least as a reviewer, is first to read the article and say, is this interesting? Is this something that is novel? In the sense, is it interesting? It's not novel, doesn't mean novel to the world all the time, but novelty in terms of are we reading something that most of us in the field did not know until then? Yeah. So that's first thing I think we ask. So from a phenomenon perspective, are you unearthing something that is novel enough in that context, in that phenomenon, whatever you're dealing with? I think so that novelty has to be there. It could be in the form, the angle that you see, the whatever. Yeah. The second is actually the abstraction piece. And I think that's where really things get difficult, because we are, in general, I did not have the training. I don't know how it is in other places, but in most of the PhD students that I have dealt with, even in the US, they struggle to theorize. And this I'm saying because they can find novel things to study, but abstracting theory from an empirical situation, a setup, is not something that's taught very easily. After doing several papers, what now I have understood is that when people ask me, it's very difficult for me to teach somebody that. Right? So I always tell them, the best way to do this is to actually co-work. Okay, and I will always do track changes. because on data analysis and papers, because then you see what I'm doing, because I'm just unable to articulate this for you, how I did the jump, how I did the abstraction, how I wish it was just simple, straightforward.
Block diagram.
Yeah, it's not a block diagram. So there is jumps in thought, and that's abstraction. So that abstraction to theory happens, I think, that way. And a lot of times, at least papers, when we get, and it's sad, as she said, where you have to reject some of these papers when they come from many places, especially when they say from India, it feels a little bit bad, because the setting is very interesting, the data is really interesting, but unfortunately, the abstraction process is not done rightly. The methods are really, really nice. The analysis is really, really nice. But you go back and ask, so what? I mean, why did you even do all this? Because it just led to knowing what we knew. So is that enough? I mean, is that enough? That question. So that's the first thing. Second is, I think what we were discussing in the afternoon, right? So very often when we read our own papers, and I think this is a real challenge, is we ask the question how and why. And I think Srivas and him had a long chat about this, and this is typical in qualitative work, is the question is how and why, because that's what qualitative questions ought to be. So you write it that way. But the answers are always what? If you go back and check your things, it's always this. So 90% of the time, your paper gets rejected, not because your quality of data is bad and things like that, but the eventual end result is not how or why, but the answer to a what question, right? And this is again, the challenge is you're trying to abstract. So so I think if you go back and ask yourself, okay, if this is a how question, simple things like, is it really messy? Am I feeling lost in trying to explain this to somebody? If none of these features are a tick, then I would suggest go back and rewrite, because as Denny Joya said in one of his papers, if you don't get lost, then what's the pleasure in getting found? So I think at least with qualitative work, this challenge is really big. I mean, how did you deal with the data? So one is novelty in the phenomenon, the empirical setup, and second is to learn the abstraction process. And I think best done by co-working, I think, at least in my limited experience.
So one suggestion that I have for this is to ask scholars who have published work to look at their first draft.
Correct.
And then you write a review for it, and then look at the review that actually came in, and then look at the R&R that was submitted, and then you review and then look at what the reviews have said, because it is a tact that is very hard, right? It doesn't come very easy. And it doesn't mean that because one is published, it comes naturally. It doesn't, right? So it is like somewhere you'll have this penny drops, but that is an exercise that you'll have to go through. And saying that this has not been done in India, so I'm doing it, is not an argument that holds in most journals. And one of the best context-led paper which everybody should read is that Zhao and Sui about why brokers don't work. So she kind of limits social capital theory as proposed by Bert, saying that in collectivistic societies, what Bert says doesn't hold good, right? It works very well in individualistic collective space where you are a broker, and so brokerage works. But in a collectivistic societies, brokers actually belong nowhere, so therefore they don't do well, right? That to me is a phenomenal context paper to say, boss, like there is limit to your theory. It works in these conditions. It doesn't work in conditions where we are, right? So in those kind of cases, the context works very, very well. But otherwise, there has to be some level of generalizability. That is where the abstraction comes out, because that's so what if it is all said and done, they don't ask that question to these American guys who publish in the US and think that is generalizable everywhere in the world. Not true. But we don't ask them question because they're the powerful guys, they're the editors, right? At least until then, we'll have to play this game.
Interesting. It brings back to me a memory. We were in this little PDW sort of thing. We're giving feedback in Bologna once. And there was this, I think, management science or one of these big journals. And he's a sociologist who's the editor. And we had done this very interesting quantitative work because we had panel data in Norway. We have good data in Norway for everything. But we picked this and we did it. And we just use control variables for saying that the context is different because this is not the university, this is, non-university startups and all that. And the paper was sent and he looked at it and he read everything. And then we were asking feedback. He said, do you really want critical feedback? We said, yes. I mean, that's why we come here. So please give it to us. Will you be able to stomach it? I said, yeah, I mean, we really want to go to a top journal. And then he started. Do you know what is a context? And that's where the discussion started. And unfortunately, my co-author recorded the conversation, which he should not have. So after we went back, we heard it and we said, oh my goodness, from the first word to the last word, he had problems with everything we had written. And then he said, no, but I think the paper has great potential. That's why I'm giving you feedback. But the point is, he just told everything out. And then he told me, you have to go and read what context means. And he gave me a bunch of papers and he said, please go and read what is a context. What are various aspects that comprise a context? Which aspect of the context is different in your context? And therefore do it. Because otherwise he says university is a context. Why? Why is it a context? There are reasons why it's a context. So if you go, like for example, the closest thing I can think of in entrepreneurship is Frederick Welter's work. She and Baker have been writing a bunch of papers on this, which is borrowed context literature. But if you really go to sociology and read some of the annual review of sociology has some papers on how to define context. So I think instead of saying India is a context, which aspect of India makes relates to that theory as a contextual difference? If you bring, I think you will have, I mean, you can just sell anything. Right? Because we have so much, see, the beauty of this country is diversity. So if you pick the right variables, you can create contextual differences for every American or British theory. That's my feeling. Yeah, sorry. Just thought I should let
That's super interesting. Yeah.
Related to Raj's answer, I'm also kind of like a non-market scholar, so I'm coming from this. Given that our country is obsessed with politics, protests, political configurations, why is entrepreneurship scholarship from India so sanitized of the political things that go through? Why don't we ask? So I was teaching a doctoral course in non-market strategy, and there's a ETP paper in Kenya where hawkers are displaced and what is their affiliation. We have such cases here. We have protests, we have political affiliations or something. Why are we why are we not looking at those things? Those are clearly things that are not. So if you are looking at political diversity, like most papers comes from a one-party nation or a two-party nation. We have like 20 parties and political alliances. So clearly we have a lot of...
I think, yeah.
Young upcoming scholars in this field should take up this work, right? So don't look at me, look at some of them, look at yourself.
And just in terms of like how we can do it, like with what YNOS has, now it's possible, right?
Yeah.
We have state information, which is probably information that we are missing. So now now we have state information, we can easily now match it to political affiliations.
Yeah, on the point of data sets, I think a lot of us don't realize, I think some of people are something, we actually have decent business registry data. The MCA business registry data is not bad if we kind of work at it. That's like most fundamental. The Scandinavian countries have it obviously very well documented, but we also have it if you want to do.
Yeah.
We do that example, I'm very interested why. There's always this thing about...
Why are you looking at us? Why are you looking at us?
OG.
So because like, okay, here's how it works, right? You work with low-hanging fruit. And so there is a lot of low-hanging fruit right now. Why should I stretch and reach out to fruit that is harder to get to right now? But yes, I think from a sociological lens, from an anthropological lens, there is so much to talk about in places like India, given... So here is what has happened over the years, right? From an anthropological stuff, there was this huge debate in terms of formalist and substantivist many years ago, saying that can we study these non-market societies using formal methods developed in the West? Because when you say something, it means a particular way in the West, but here they could have multiple meanings to it. So substantivists kind of went away. They are no longer, you don't hear about them. But all these kind of affiliations, underlying conversations about hierarchy, caste, they're all clouded in language that only those people who know that context understand that this is what they actually mean, right? So that particular is much harder to tease out. One, it's harder to tease out, but two, it is harder to publish.
Yes.
because substantivists are no longer sitting at editorial saying that this is a great case for you to write about, right? So people who are on tenure track won't write because you won't get publications easily. But by the time you tenure, you're tired, you don't want to work on hard stuff anymore, right? So that could be the reason. But it is.
Yeah, just that we haven't done anything of that. Yeah,
Yeah, but that's
like,
something.
yeah, keep Joanna keeps Joanna Mayer keeps talking about like I want democracy and entrepreneurship. Yeah. Yes.
Hi, thanks, professors, for this wonderful sort of session. My question is regarding, you mentioned that how can we create an academic community?
Perfect. Thanks for moving on the conversation.
Yeah.
I want to push that on. Yes.
So basically, so what I feel that, as a researcher, as an early career researcher, that we need mentorship from people who are basically, trained in this kind of, methodology or maybe theorizing. Because I have worked on my data set, and the one problem that I'm facing is how to theorize for 50 journals, right? So maybe something that we can do is that we talk about shadowing, entrepreneur. Why don't shadow academicians or researchers or people who have already done a lot of things, right? So possibly we can sort of create a community wherein we are regularly meeting as entrepreneurial community and talk about, these things wherein you people are there to guide us. And then we can probably shoot some questions that we have in mind. You can tell us right away that whether it looks interesting, it doesn't look interesting. Then possibly we can think of, creating something valuable in the Indian ecosystem. And I think that with you people, leading the way, I think that we can do something about this. So that's my thought.
Yeah, very good. Because in 2010, I did a paper development workshop when I just joined, thinking that something like this doesn't work. So it was done with SMS. We had all the editors of SNJ, AMJ, SCJ just about started. But I was told by powers to be then, if I do something like that, I will not tenure. So I stopped doing it subsequently. But Charles and I have thought a lot about it, saying that we should do PDWs and not really conferences, because conferences people come and present and go, whereas PDWs is what we should do. So we did one with ASQ, we did one with AMJ and all. And one of the things that we thought at that point of time, Charles and I are now tired, again, young people, like talking to, he said, a good place to start is with writers. Can we get writers and ask them to do a workshop in terms of how do they write? Because it's not, the problem with Indian doctoral students is not about methods, because that's no longer the case.
Yes.
They write literature review very well because they're reading. They know the methods very well. Their results, which is very good, right? Sometimes we may even be able to abstract, but how do you create that narrative that captures people's attention is something that we have not yet honed on. So in addition to PDW, we need to get people who are good at, like authors, who are good at storytelling to tell us how to tell the story. Because that is again a capability that we should develop, and maybe we could start to look at it. One, mentoring in terms of paper double. Many years ago, again, I tried so many times, like you said, I went and asked people, scholars from the West, saying that, can you do a PDW? And I do remember Fanish saying that, look, I don't want to do a random PDW. Get me 3 people or 4 people who have R&Rs and we'll convert them. So the workshop is going to be people who have R&Rs are the ones that we interact with. The rest of the crowd only watches. And we'll make sure that we'll convert these R&Rs, right? Which we don't know how to do. When we have R&R, most top scholars know exactly what needs to be done because the editors have told you what to do for them to accept the paper. So he said, like, I'll get this thing done. So we can even get some of these top scholars to say that here's an R&R. Now, how do I convert this? Make sure that high risk to conditional accept in a very short span, right? So that is another capability that we should develop. So action point,
Super.
wiki. Second action point is like
mentorship, shadowing, writers.
How do we do
writers,
PDW workshops?
Yeah.
PDW workshops that we should
R&R workshops and then writer storytelling workshops. All combined, together. Yeah.
Definitely, we need a community around academic scholarship.
Super.
Yeah.
Right. So
I want to just And something is that unlike Shrivas, who's in an English native country, I'm working with Dutch students who very often have also good data, good ideas, and sometimes they also, for them, I think India doesn't have that problem. For them, sometimes translating the language thing becomes where they lose out on perhaps the writing part of it and their way of thinking. So it's a little bit different. It's not that the English is incorrect, but it's just not academic enough. The problem I find with ChatGPT 4, which they all are, using all the time, but they're not using it well. So as a result, sometimes when I'm reading it, I'm saying the English is good, but this paper makes no sense because somewhere wrong you've translated line by line and you've lost the whole meaning of what you're saying. So of course, I'm trying to say that we need to have a caution as to how we use some tools and how we go about this. But I meant that what you're facing perhaps here, I find that I've got students, and the same thing happens about linking their data with the theory. One is to abstract it, but the other thing is also that your data is not saying what you think it's saying. It's saying something great, but sometimes you miss the nuance in it. So you're telling me that this data is saying that these women were proud, but no, I don't see that. So maybe you can see it, but you've not put it down clearly enough. So there are two things here about how well you can link that. And I think it's easier when another person reads it, not necessarily a huge scholar, but anyone else. Yeah.
And just thinking about what Sir and Sumit's question, one of the things that we've been sort of thinking about is like, if you look at the academy has every year one of the social enterprise doctoral seminar type thing, which kind of happens a week before academy. Like one potential way of having the conversation going, keeping the academic community together is probably kind of think about this as a cohort-based annual session, potentially online, so that it's more inclusive, open, maybe in a place if we tag it to a place or conference. Is potentially one mechanism, but
so he's giving a lot of suggestions. I'll probably do it in IIM Bangalore, the first one.
Okay.
He looked at me 4 times, the potential, this, that. Okay. I take the hint. I can do it in May when students are not there, and so that we could have Society for Entrepreneurial Researchers to say that who can we get. May, June is a good time. Bangalore is also a good time where the rest of the crowd would want to leave. I can't suggest Ahmedabad in May. Right? So
Yes.
So that we'll have to go back and get those guys, but I'm sure they will. Right? So as far as the event goes, we probably can kick off at Bangalore. Happy to work on that.
Students here to get RR over there. Then it will be good to sometimes see them through.
Yeah.
That's a more serious.
Yeah. Any thoughts? No, Mike was somewhere in there. Mike was somewhere.
If I may,
So whoever has the mic can ask questions.
Yeah.
I was just, if I may, hoping to speak to Vivek's point and also something that Ira had raised earlier to a larger issue. Because I had this conversation like 2 days ago, the fact that, as you said, many of these frameworks and measures are developed in the West, even lenses, whether it's gender, things like political affiliation are developed for two-party situations. And so there are researchers working on political affiliations in India, entrepreneurship context, and their papers are getting rejected because the measures are very coarse, whatever they have been able to develop from the data. And so and gender also, right, the way we look at it. My question is, so we talk about creating an academic community. All of us want to work on the core problem, an entrepreneurship related problem or a strategy related problem. There are these sort of supporting needs, right? Somebody needs to now develop a measure for multi-party affiliations. How do we weave that in? I mean, taking an ecosystem lens again. Entrepreneurship research is an ecosystem. So if multiple people have the need for, say, multi-party political affiliation, can somebody take up that? How do we then push it to journals? What value does that have? How do we think of it as a larger problem? Because the same researcher cannot do it. It's too much of an ask. So how do we kind of enable that is a question I have. I mean, it's a thought. I think
like the point of building on from others' work doesn't happen that naturally or as much as I like to happen in India as it does in the rest of the world. I think part of the reason why I think the community element to this is because we need that to happen, because without that we are probably not pushing the field. We are just doing random pockets of things in different directions, just pulling ourselves in different directions. So if we have more of this community type approach, once a year physically, maybe once a quarter online, do something. I think that sort of a mechanism will ensure that we kind of know what others are doing, part one, and part two, know what support's needed, what can help to others. Maybe one of this is like an R&R workshop. So you come and present an R&R, everyone kind of gives you suggestions on how you can push the R&R forward. Because this happens. Like there are, what is it? OS has one of those, this thing, right? What is that thing called? URAM has, I'm missing the name. So EGOS has one of the subgroups where they do this, where there's this like sort of, bring R&Rs in, we will give you suggestions types. So, yeah, that's the one, correct. Ground reading group. So that sort of mechanisms, we know. I mean, it's not that it's alien. We have kind of seen this work. There is SIR lab. I was talking to him in the morning, where like it's York based, and all that they do is they run experiments. Their experiments, Tanzania, Ghana, Sri Lanka, they just do one thing, but then they have a big community that they've kind of built over a period of time. Everyone knows how to run experiments. Same method, but then different question, different context. So can we do such community-based thinking around either leveraging on a method or leveraging on community to build on from others' work? I think that's sort of what we really need, at least in the way I'm seeing this.
Specifically on this, I'm saying that's why you need an Indian-based or whatever setup, because I don't think you'll get answers to that kind of a question in an EGOS forum. So, and I'm thinking, of course, you can also think outside the box. One is to ask each other, because there would be some measure, some data you haven't heard of, but also there could be, I don't know, some cricket affiliations, and try and see how linking those could shed some light on political affiliations or whatever, that kind of creativity. But just listening to you, I'm thinking it would be fun to actually brainstorm ideas as to how you do it. And we need a community like this to be able to get that out.
But suggestion is, world is not fair. So we have to grin and bear. Do not try to do any of these when you're tenuring. Do not try to do any of these big picture, I will change the world kind of thing while you're tenuring. Look at it very strategically, close your tenure. Once your tenure is closed, you can do any stunts. After that, yes, there are so many things that we need to worry about, and we need to push towards a much fairer, better, inclusive world. We have been around for 5 billion years. We're going to be around for some years as well. So pace yourself, because it's very important to pace yourself and keep your well-being. So do not try to get to places where there's a lot of friction and resistance. Certainly not at the stage in which you are right now. So hopefully you still have the energy once you tenure, but I guess collectively we'd start to work on it a little bit. It can come in. But I do have a feeling that given how randomly the world is changing, it's only a matter of time Trump is going to make papers like these come into journals, right? Because it's is it democratic? It isn't, right? The way in which he's going to work is not going to be, is going to be quite similar to what's happening currently, right? So people are going to theorize about it. People are going to talk about it and how this plays out, right? There it is. They're wearing it on their sleeves. Elon Musk is there. Peter Thiel is there. And then they're wearing it on their sleeves here as well, but we can't theorize as much or talk as much as one would like to. But suggestion, wait until you have secured your position, and you can't be thrown out after you are tenured. And
yes. We talked about the Indians having been entrepreneurial for 5,000 years, 10,000 years. We've always done that and kind of thing. Is it a sort of a wrong positioning itself? I mean, how is it different than a new business being set up? Entrepreneurship. Have we created another animal? And what about the good old theory of farms, Jensen Mackling's agency theory, the resource dependence theory, and all that? Yes, we can sort of contextualize it in that sense. But how entrepreneurship is fundamentally different than a new business being set up by anyone, a family firm or a OYO or whatever?
So I would look at it in terms of imaginations, right? Two things. Like, unlike in the past, you could start with absolutely nothing and create a $100 million company by talking about the value, by bringing out the value, tease out the value through conversations without even putting a single paisa or writing a single line of code. that you are now able to talk about creating a venture that is futuristic, sustainable. I think there is something which is different, right? So for me, the part that is extremely interesting about entrepreneurship is a paper by Feller and Zeng
Felin and Zenga.
Fellin and Zenga, entrepreneurs as theorists. I think it's such a wonderful paper to say that, like, so how do people with no resources end up having product? Like it said, like 90% of radical innovation after post-war have come from entrepreneurs. The light that we have, the projector, the floor on which we're sitting are all entrepreneurial dreams at some point of time, right? So the way in which they think up a value is something that has not been is inexplicable for me. As in, I'm saying, you take away a lot of it has already been said, like the 200 years of people thinking about what ventures happen. But for me, it is like how babies learn language. When they don't have any language or any words substrate to build their vocabulary on, but they learn the language faster than you.
No quarrel with that, except that you still had a Jamshedji Tata who set up a steel plant, obviously required a huge capital. And you had the...
So you're saying that should we not look at history?
No,
I'm looking at it from abstract.
No, sir. I was saying the way you mentioned that you could start with nothing, but that's true even today. You can start with nothing also, and people have started with nothing, especially the tech entrepreneurs in the context of today's economy and the size of economy. They probably start with nothing. And in the olden days also, Jamshedji Tata would have required crores of rupees to start a steel plant, and the Bangalore Idli Wala would have started with nothing. So to that extent, I was just, having done a bit of reading of late, I find that this new business and entrepreneurship actually sort of coincide and represent the same thing. So is it either we challenge the theories around theory of firm, agency theory, resource dependent theory, and all that. And rightly so, we should challenge them. There have been 50-year-old theories and the Indian flavors and the stuff into that. Yes, of course we should do that. But is entrepreneurship itself a new theory construct? You can publish around that, yes. That's, I'm sorry, I'm sort of maybe upsetting the apple cart.
No, it's not upsetting. I had an economist who said, like, what is entrepreneurship?
I've heard this, yeah.
It is all done and dusted in 1932 when Schumpeter wrote.
Yeah.
Right? So why do you guys even need to study entrepreneurship? Because Schumpeter said whatever needs to be said. It is like if there are opportunities, people will find them. Why do you even need to study them? Right? So it's not about new thinking for me. Look, I'm not a strategy guy. I don't know anything about management. I'm kind of a trespasser who came into a business school. I studied handlooms and I don't know how I got in because the only thing I know is entrepreneurship. So for me, the exciting part is how do you create value? And sometimes the value creation, like if you're talking about Jamshedji. No, I'm not saying any new business. It's about like, do you have resources to build it? Yeah. A lot of theories that say that you have resources like access to funds, access to capital, access to social capital, human capital, financial capital. Like these are the resources that you play with, right? But how do you play when you don't have any resources? You're not from a family business. You don't have access to money. You have no social capital. You're a first-time entrepreneur. Now trying to decipher how am I going to make money because it is transforming of if you're looking at transformation of a temporary organization into a sustainable business model, how does that transformation happen in terms of a non-linear, uncertain manner where you are predicting and about future, taking punts about future without knowing what the future is going to be, right? I think this interplay between dreams, beliefs, resources, and how you play the game, I have no idea if you have said it's already been written about.
Yeah.
No, I feel that strategy makes it too simple. That exploration, exploit. I'm not a strategy scholar. I know very little about it. I'm sitting here in a business school, which is being recorded and saying all kinds of these swaggy statements. But I do feel that there is a lot that people assume in terms of that value creation is very easy. Yeah. If it is so easy, why do you need a ChatGPT to come out of OpenAI who didn't have any resources? And not Google or Microsoft. Yeah. Or if you look at
So just to bring some little bit more like I already have a mic. Yeah. Oh, is it?
In terms of
Oh,
time,
okay. Very quickly. So a lot of Schumpeter's work, I feel, talks about who's the actor who leads from equilibrium to disequilibrium in an economy. But there's also an equal amount of work, as you said in the past, which has been done about how it is brought back from disequilibrium to equilibrium. So a lot of the businesses that you're talking about, like similar looking businesses with resources.
Yeah, got you. I'll give number. Yeah, go.
I think Kurzner? No, Kurzner. Kurzner, yeah, they kind of talk the opposite languages. So if you look at like the work, so what I'm beginning to think, just to quickly wrap this up, is it's like a continuum. So you're moving back from equilibrium to disequilibrium to equilibrium, and the cycle goes on. There's a bunch of actions that move you this way and then this way. You'll find a lot of the radical, imaginative, all that taking you from equilibrium to disequilibrium. Less when it comes, so it'll look like more like the traditional small business. If you had resources, you could start, because for example, if you have to start a similar looking business, and imagine imitative business, then it's more like moving from disequilibrium to equilibrium. So you're trying, because there's just too much economic profits, people are trying to fight for it. Over time, it is distributed and then comes back to a thing. And then a radical guy comes and says, hey, why are we doing all this? Let's rethink this completely. And then again sends everything into a role. And then over time again this. So I think one half is like this real entrepreneurial action. When we think of entrepreneurial action, it's more about this. Who are these guys who bring it to disequilibrium, driving this? And then the rest of it is also there, which is important for an economy to be brought back. But I think it's like two different things. I don't know. This is the way I make sense of it.
No, but you've got a point that we should not ignore classics.
Yeah.
Right? A lot has been written about and said. If you go back to sciences as artificial.
Yes.
So if you go back to organizations by March and Simon and March. Like there's a lot that they have said which can be drawn from.
It's a huge.
So in the interest of time, we're just kind of moving into the final part, which is just some potential forthcoming calls for papers. One, I'm just looking at that time, so I'm like, yeah. So that's forthcoming.
7 minutes
late. Okay, so we have some. So we'll take your question later on. So there's one more question that was there. We'll take your question. So just in terms of forthcoming calls for papers related to entrepreneurship context sort of stories, there's a JMS call for August 2025, which might be of interest to some people in this room. There's an ERD call for early next year, which is emerging developing economy focused grand challenges focused one. There's an ETP entrepreneurship ecosystem focused call for, I think it's an April deadline again. That is ETP. And then given what I've heard from multiple people in offline conversations, there's a lot of interest around digital entrepreneurship stuff. So there's a digital entrepreneurship call out at ISBJ, for instance. So some of the calls coming out next year to pick up on if you're doing things around this space. I have all your emails with me from one of the emails that kind of came a couple of days ago. So we will put this out on the email list so that you have, like I saw photos being taken. If you want, you can take photos, but then you will have the deck coming your way as well to have a reference to what we are talking about. And one final thing is part of putting together this panel is thanks to funding from the Spark grant. And as part of the Spark grant that I have with IIM Udaipur, we are planning to put together a book on context-inspired entrepreneurship cases from India. So if you're working on cases, context-specific stories, let's say rural, social, cultural, digital, or ecosystem support organizations working on context-specific aspects, look out for, again, I'll push it out when the exact call is out to your emails. So do keep this in your timeline of action. The book has to be out by July. So I'll be nudging you for stuff to come to my table by at least March. So just giving you advance notice of putting this community together. Let's sort of put some of the cases that we already are working on into that form. It's a relatively low-hanging fruit. I know book chapters don't count into tenure track stuff, but if you're already working on cases which you have, then this is sort of a way by which you can potentially bring it into a book that can go into teaching in classrooms, because there's not enough context-specific cases on Indian entrepreneurship that we have access to. Even if we have access to HBS, that is expensive for a lot of the colleges in India. So we are looking at, can we create resources which can democratize entrepreneurship, both in terms of practice, knowledge sharing, as well as in classroom. So look out for the call that comes your way. Happy to take one more question because I've saved 7 minutes. Go on.
Okay, so I don't have a question. Rather, I have a thought to put on the table that he has said that, the PhD scholars should be among the entrepreneurs to actually understand the dynamics and how things work. And as Professor Raj, you were saying that, there is what we say, we understand the context of India. However, when we abstract that idea, there is we see difficulty. Okay. Now, I want to put a thought on table, which is, why not we look academicians ourselves as entrepreneurs? Because when we publish a paper, we see our paper as a product. Okay, and I am a PhD student, hence I see myself being incubated. I'm from IIM Kozhikode, so I am incubated at IIM Kozhikode, and I see my supervisor as my board member, which my thesis committee as my board member. And now when I get the grant, I see the seed funding to do something. For example, now I am here on the conference grant, and someday, let's say I'd be collaborating with the fellow sitting beside me, and I see it.
So it's a solo author.
Maybe him, sir, as a co-author, and I see it as a co-founder for a product, which is a paper.
Yeah.
So once we get into the shoes of an entrepreneur, how it changes to abstract the ideas is what I want to put on the table. That
in fact, I'll push that very good point.
Yeah.
Super agree with that point. Well articulated, claps. And in fact, I'll push it one step ahead. It's like, if we often just see the paper as the product, but then we almost stop at that product. We don't actually sell the product enough. That is a critique that I have of what we think about this.
So, but once we use his metaphor of as an entrepreneur, then selling also comes, selling yourself as comes, right? So, there's an interesting book called Startup of You by Reid Hoffman. Yeah. So you now need to convert that for Startup of You for academic documents.
And also this, you were mentioning earlier, this Felin, their group also wrote a paper, very interesting paper called Scientist as Entrepreneur, I think, which also is, you should look at that, because that has some, you'll get something to.
Very entrepreneurial thought. So you could now work on that and then create a template for all of us.
And in fact, just on the point of selling, there is a lot more that we could do in terms of, let's say, communicating what is in our papers into what is understood by people. Totally. I mean, like, we are almost always just writing to other people in this room, and not really writing to people outside this room. I mean, so what can we do to do that is also something that we need to think about. Because from personal experience, writing stuff like blogs or being on podcast has opened doors which I never even thought there were doors there. So sometimes when you start doing those sorts of outreach efforts, it potentially opens very, very new possibilities. So metaphor until bringing the paper product, but also how the academic can sell the product for different audiences and get the right fit for different audiences is something that we also need to think about.
Saras talks about it. Write a paper, write a HBR, write a newspaper article, as a multiple newspaper articles.
Yes.
He said all of it is the process.
Yes.
I keep saying it's too much work. It's okay. I don't have to do it, but I know you, you're popular. If I want anybody, I'll talk to you. Yeah. But you're right. It's a game that needs to be played. Talk to us, but talk to practitioners through MIT, SMR, HBR, newspaper articles, blogs, podcasts. Yeah, absolutely.
But also, just to make it worthwhile, is that, like you said, a new product, and you don't give up when it doesn't hit public.
Yeah.
Yes. Yes.
Yes. Also, I like the idea that there are different marketplaces, as you said, that practitioner journals and these journals. Professor Srivas, I have one more idea over it, what you said. I am seeing, from this conversation, I am seeing that when we publish the article, we have put the product in the marketplace. And when we see the citations, I see it, okay, idea sold, like that. So,
Yeah.
thought to build upon, but it's from
Any closing thoughts, or are we good to close 2 minutes later?
Ask any question.
Oh, okay.
Who ask question? Otherwise, we will cold call.
No?
Because we are backs to them, they didn't see us.
Challenges.
So now the university is coming up with incubation centers, and in the new education policy, as this incubation center is taking up place. Now, the entrepreneurship faculties, now they are mentoring the startups in the university, like the university in which I am, the initiative of the venture lab has initiated. So in which the bachelor student, the 4-year program, in the very first year of their stage, they are given to come up with an idea, and that's the 10 credit course in the curriculum. And the teachers are assigned as a mentor. So they can guide them throughout those 4 years, and eventually some of them can come up with a successful venture. So this is kind of.
I think like there's a lot that could be done around incubators. Yeah.
Not be working as an entrepreneur as well as a faculty, but we can work behind the entrepreneurs as a back.
With incubators. I mean, absolutely. And like with AICs almost there in every college now, like the access is no longer a problem, as we were kind of saying earlier. Like now everyone has access. Now it's about what can we do individually, collectively, strategically around this.
That you can use it in the class.
Yeah, you can bring it back to the class.
Vivek, we'll close. Thank you so much. We'll follow up on things with email. If somebody can pick up Wiki, yeah, that's a question. Yeah, we need volunteers for the Wiki.
Somebody who understands Chinese.
Oh, sorry. What? Okay. No volunteers for Wiki? We will force volunteers here.
Army style volunteers.
Army style volunteers. Yeah.
Volunteers.
Yeah. Thank you so much.
They're catching.